The simulation chamber erupted in a symphony of destruction that should have been impossible. Thex'vira's tactical neural implants processed the chaos in microseconds, calculating trajectories and threat assessments, while her amber eyes tracked the human cadets below. They moved through the holographic battlefield like wounded animals, chaotic, unpredictable, completely contrary to every strategic principle she'd mastered in her 2 centuries of military service. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. Jackson Torres vaulted over a collapsed barrier, his muscular frame absorbing impacts that would have shattered her delicate Xerathi bone structure. His dark hair was matted with synthetic blood from the training simulation, but his green eyes blazed with something she didn't recognize. Behind him, Reese Martinez provided covering fire while dragging an injured Kai Nakamura to safety, her smaller frame trembling under his weight but refusing to abandon him. Pure illogic, the observation deck's reinforced transparasteel offered her a perfect view of their tactical incompetence. Thex'vira's elongated fingers, each one equipped with precision neural interfaces, danced across her holographic display, recording every mistake for her inevitable report to the Xerathi High Command. These humans would never survive real combat. Instructor Morrison's gravelly voice echoed through the Academy's speakers. End simulation. All cadets report to the briefing room. The holographic explosions faded, leaving only the sterile metal walls of Grimholt Military Academy's training complex. Thex'vira descended the observation stairs, her movements fluid and calculated, each step a study in efficiency that her instructors had praised since childhood. The humans clustered together like pack animals, their voices overlapping in excited chatter about the exercise. Sweat gleamed on their strange, warm skin, another inefficiency she couldn't comprehend. Xerathi physiology had evolved beyond such crude temperature regulation millennia ago. Jackson looked up as she approached, and something flickered across his expression. Not quite recognition, but awareness. His gaze lingered on her pale, almost translucent skin and the intricate tattoo-like neural pathways that traced patterns along her temples. Impressive work in there. His words carried that peculiar human quality, warmth without calculation. Thex'vira's analytical mind cataloged it as another weakness. The exercise parameters were elementary. Any competent soldier should have achieved similar results. She kept her voice level, professional. Jackson's mouth quirked into what humans called a smile, and she felt an unexpected flutter in her primary neural cluster. Malfunction, perhaps. She'd have the Academy's medical bay run diagnostics later. Elementary, huh? Well, you kept up pretty well from the observation deck. Reese joined them, her auburn hair pulled back in the practical ponytail favored by human military personnel. Her brown eyes held a sharpness that reminded Thex'vira uncomfortably of her own species' predatory focus. Cut her some slack, Jax. Not everyone learns to fight dirty in the sandbox. The comment was clearly meant as humor, but Thex'vira processed it as potential intelligence. Fighting dirty, another indication of human tactical deficiency. Proper military doctrine emphasized precision, not improvisation. The briefing room's harsh fluorescent lighting cast sharp shadows across the assembled cadets' faces. Instructor Morrison, a grizzled human veteran whose scars spoke of countless conflicts, stood before a holographic display showing cross-sections of Grimholt's subterranean training facilities. Today's exercise takes place in the Deep Complex. Level 5, Section D. Thex'vira's enhanced memory instantly recalled the facility specifications. Section D housed the Academy's most challenging terrain simulations, underground cave systems designed to test soldiers' adaptability in confined spaces. Her tactical processors began calculating optimal movement patterns and resource allocation strategies. Morrison's weathered features hardened as he continued. This isn't a game. The environmental controls down there are real. If you screw up, you won't respawn in the medical bay. You'll suffocate in the dark. The human cadets shifted nervously, but Thex'vira felt only anticipation. Finally, a challenge worthy of her capabilities. Her species had conquered lightless worlds before humans had even developed rudimentary spaceflight. Underground operations were simply another equation to solve. teams of 5. Mixed species integration protocols are in effect. Thex'vira's hearts, both primary and secondary, accelerated slightly. Mixed teams meant she'd be paired with humans, forced to observe their inefficiencies at close range. The research opportunities were substantial. Torres, Martinez, Nakamura, Chen, and Thex'vira, your alpha team. Lila Chen stepped forward, a compact human with intelligent dark eyes and an engineer's precision in her movements. Thex'vira had observed her during previous exercises, noting her tendency to overthink tactical situations. Another human weakness disguised as contemplation. The descent to level 5 took place in a utilitarian transport tube that reeked of metal and human perspiration. Thex'vira positioned herself near the ventilation system, her sensitive respiratory organs filtering the crude atmosphere. The humans seemed oblivious to the oppressive environment, talking and joking as if they weren't descending into a potential death trap. Jackson sat directly across from her, checking his equipment with methodical precision. His hands moved with surprising competence over his rifle's mechanisms, and Thex'vira found herself studying the way his fingers manipulated the components. Human digits were shorter than hers, blunter, less elegant, yet somehow more capable of gross motor tasks. First time in the deep complex, his question interrupted her analysis. Thex'vira's gaze met his, and again she felt that strange neural flutter. Perhaps the Academy's atmospheric controls were malfunctioning. No, I have extensive experience with subterranean operations. My species has been conducting underground military campaigns for longer than humans have existed as a civilization. The words emerged more sharply than she'd intended. Jackson's expression shifted, not offense, but something closer to curiosity. Around them, the other humans exchanged glances she couldn't interpret. Must be nice, having that kind of experience to draw on. Reese's tone carried subtle layers Thex'vira's linguistic processors couldn't fully decode. Sarcasm, perhaps, or challenge. Humans were frustratingly imprecise in their communications. The transport tube lurched to a halt, and Morrison's voice crackled through their comm units. Alpha Team, you're cleared for entry. Remember, this is a live exercise. Watch each other's backs down there. The airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Thex'vira stepped into the deep complex for the first time. Her enhanced vision adjusted instantly to the dim lighting, revealing a tunnel system carved from natural rock and reinforced with military-grade polymers. The air tasted of stone and recycled atmosphere, carrying undertones of moisture and decay that spoke of genuine underground environments. Her tactical display immediately began mapping their surroundings, creating a three-dimensional model of the immediate area. The humans moved more cautiously, their inferior vision forcing them to rely on helmet-mounted illumination that would give away their position to any competent enemy. Another inefficiency. The exercise parameters were straightforward: navigate the tunnel system, locate 3 hidden data caches, and extract to the surface within 4 hours. Thex'vira's strategic planning algorithms had already identified 17 optimal routes before they'd traveled 50 meters into the complex. The first cache was positioned in a chamber approximately 300 meters ahead, accessible through a narrow passage that would require single-file movement. Elementary tactics suggested sending the smallest team member through first to secure the area. "I'll take point." Jackson's declaration contradicted optimal strategy. Thex'vira's analytical mind immediately identified the flaw in his reasoning. Tactical error. Lila is smallest and most suited for reconnaissance in confined spaces. Jackson turned to face her, and in the dim light of the tunnel, his features took on sharper angles. There was something in his expression she couldn't catalog, determination mixed with something else. Protection instinct, perhaps. Lila's our tech specialist. If there are traps up ahead, we need her intact to disarm them. I can handle whatever's waiting in there. The logic was flawed, yet somehow compelling. Thex'vira's processors worked to understand the underlying calculation, but human reasoning patterns consistently defied rational analysis. She watched as Jackson shouldered his rifle and advanced toward the narrow passage, his movements careful but confident. The passage was barely wide enough for human shoulders, carved from native rock that gleamed with moisture in their helmet lights. Thex'vira followed behind Jackson, her enhanced vision tracking the subtle changes in air pressure and temperature that indicated possible hazards ahead. She could hear his breathing, steady, controlled, but distinctly human in its organic rhythm. The sound was oddly comforting, though she couldn't identify why. Her species had evolved beyond such primitive social cues. The passage opened into a circular chamber where ancient stone met modern tactical architecture. Emergency lighting cast blood-red shadows across the walls, and the first data cache sat on a raised platform in the center of the space. Jackson approached it cautiously, his rifle trained on potential threat vectors. Too easy. His words proved prophetic. The explosion wasn't real. Holographic projectors created the illusion of collapsing rock and structural failure. But the environmental consequences were genuine. Warning klaxons screamed through their comm systems as emergency protocols engaged, sealing blast doors and cutting off their primary exit route. Emergency lockdown initiated. All teams remain in position until engineers can assess structural integrity. Morrison's voice carried tension that sent alarm signals through Thex'vira's neural networks. Around her, the humans were checking their equipment, their movements quick but controlled. She accessed her tactical display and felt her primary heart skip as the readings populated. They were trapped 100 meters underground, with approximately 90 minutes of breathable air. Jackson moved to the sealed blast door, running his hands along its edges with methodical precision. His tactical scanner painted the barrier in shades of red, locked, reinforced, impassable through conventional means. Lila's voice cut through the chamber's oppressive atmosphere. "I can try to hack the door controls, but it'll take time. Maybe 40 minutes if the security protocols aren't too complex." Reese was already calculating their resources, her analytical mind working through scenarios with mechanical precision. That leaves us 50 minutes of air as a safety margin, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Kai laughed, a sound that held no humor. When does anything ever go according to plan down here? Thex'vira's enhanced cognitive abilities immediately began processing alternatives. Her species had developed advanced psychological conditioning techniques that allowed for extended periods in low-oxygen environments. She could survive considerably longer than the humans if conservation became necessary. The logical course was obvious. I can reduce my metabolic rate to extend survival time. This will provide additional oxygen for the rest of the team. The words emerged with clinical precision, but something in the humans' reactions suggested she'd made an error in calculation. They turned to stare at her with expressions she couldn't parse, shock, perhaps, or disbelief. Jackson's voice carried a quality she'd never heard before. "That's not happening." His statement defied logical analysis. Thex'vira's neural processors worked to understand the underlying reasoning, but found only inefficiency. The mathematics are clear. 1 Xerathi life versus 4 human lives represents optimal resource allocation. She kept her tone neutral, professional. This was simply tactical analysis, no different from ammunition distribution or equipment prioritization. But the humans' reactions suggested otherwise. Reese stepped closer, her brown eyes blazing with something that made Thex'vira's secondary heart accelerate. "We don't leave people behind, ever." The emphasis on the final word carried weight that Thex'vira's linguistic processors struggled to decode. She looked around the chamber, studying each human face in turn. Kai's expression held determination. Lila's showed fierce resolve. Jackson's features had hardened into something approaching anger. None of it made sense. Your species' emotional attachments are interfering with logical decision-making. The words emerged before she could stop them. In the silence that followed, she heard only the hum of ventilation systems and the distant drip of moisture from the chamber's walls. Jackson moved closer, and she found herself looking up into his green eyes. This close, she could see the gold flecks that surrounded his pupils, could smell the distinctly human scent of his skin beneath the tactical gear. Maybe, but those emotional attachments are what make us worth saving. His words carried layers of meaning that her analytical mind couldn't fully process. She wanted to argue, to present the logical fallacies in his reasoning, but something in his expression stopped her. For the first time in her life, Thex'vira's certainty wavered. Lila had spread her engineering equipment across the chamber floor, her slender fingers working with surgical precision over circuit boards and interface cables. The blast door's control panel had been removed, revealing a nest of fiber optic connections that pulsed with data streams. Security protocols are more complex than I expected. This might take longer than 40 minutes. Kai was monitoring their air supply, his scanner painting atmospheric readings in increasingly urgent shades of orange. They had perhaps 70 minutes before oxygen levels dropped to critical thresholds. Thex'vira watched the humans work with growing fascination. Their movements held none of the elegant efficiency she'd been trained to value, but possessed something else, a desperate creativity that bent rules without breaking them. Reese had improvised additional lighting using emergency flares, casting dancing shadows that somehow made the chamber feel less oppressive. Jackson moved between team members, checking equipment and offering encouragement that served no tactical purpose, yet somehow improved overall performance. They were behaving like a family unit under stress. The realization struck her with unexpected force. Her species had eliminated familial bonds centuries ago, recognizing them as evolutionary weaknesses that interfered with optimal decision-making. The Xerathi military prized individual excellence above all else, each soldier a perfect, self-contained unit requiring no external support. But watching these humans, she began to understand that their weakness might actually be strength. 45 minutes had passed when Lila's equipment sparked and died. The engineer's face went pale as she stared at the fried circuits, her hands trembling slightly as she checked and rechecked the connections. Power surge. The door's defensive systems are more sophisticated than anything I've encountered. I can't break through without proper equipment. The chamber fell silent except for the steady hiss of their breathing apparatus. Thex'vira's tactical processors immediately began recalculating survival probabilities, and the results were not encouraging. They had 40 minutes of air remaining and no viable exit strategy. Logical analysis suggested panic, despair, or at minimum some form of psychological breakdown. Instead, the humans moved closer together. Jackson's hand found Reese's shoulder. Kai moved to support Lila, his presence offering comfort that served no tactical function. They were physically reinforcing their pack bonds, drawing strength from proximity that her species would consider counterproductive. "We'll figure something out." Jackson's voice held absolute conviction despite the mathematical impossibility of their situation. Thex'vira stared at him, her analytical mind working to understand how he could maintain such certainty in the face of overwhelming odds. "Your statement contradicts available evidence. We are trapped with insufficient air and no viable extraction method." Her words emerged with clinical precision, but something in her tone had changed. The absolute certainty that had defined her entire existence was beginning to crack. Jackson turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his expression that her processors couldn't categorize. Warmth, perhaps, or understanding. When he spoke, his voice carried gentle humor. "You're not wrong. Logically, we're screwed. But humans don't always operate on logic." He gestured toward Lila, who was already pulling apart her damaged equipment to salvage components. "Watch." For the next 20 minutes, Thex'vira observed something that defied every principle of tactical doctrine she'd ever learned. The humans began cannibalizing their personal equipment, communication devices, helmet displays, even weapon components, to create a jury-rigged solution that shouldn't have worked. Reese donated the power cells from her backup scanner. Kai provided precision tools that were technically irreplaceable. Jackson contributed the targeting computer from his rifle, effectively disabling his primary weapon. Each sacrifice reduced their individual capabilities while strengthening the group's collective resources. Lila worked with desperate concentration, her fingers flying over improvised connections as she built something that existed nowhere in any manual. Her equipment buzzed and sparked, filling the chamber with the acrid smell of overloaded circuits. Thex'vira found herself holding her breath, both literally and metaphorically, as the engineer made final adjustments to her creation. The device hummed to life, and the blast door's control panel flickered with new activity. "Got it." Lila's voice held exhausted triumph as the massive door began to cycle open. Emergency lighting spilled through the widening gap, and the Xerathi could smell the cleaner air of the main tunnels beyond. They had 15 minutes of oxygen remaining. As they gathered their remaining equipment, the Xerathi found herself moving alongside Jackson. Her enhanced cognitive abilities were processing everything she'd witnessed, trying to understand the fundamental miscalculation in her analysis of human capabilities. "Your tactical approach is highly inefficient." The words emerged before she could stop them. Jackson looked at her with that strange expression again, not offense, but something approaching amusement. "Probably, but it works for us." They reached the main tunnel, where emergency teams were already positioning equipment for their extraction. As medics checked their vital signs and atmospheric contamination levels, Thex'vira realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of military doctrine. The humans had achieved victory not despite their emotional bonds, but because of them. The extraction process took another 30 minutes, during which Thex'vira found herself staying close to her team despite having no tactical reason to do so. When they finally reached the surface levels of Grimholt Academy, she felt an unexpected emotion at being separated from them for medical evaluation. The Academy's medical base smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, a sterile environment that reminded her of Xerathi facilities. She submitted to the standard post-incident examinations, allowing human medical personnel to verify that her alien physiology had suffered no adverse effects from their ordeal. But when Jackson appeared in the doorway of her examination room, she felt her primary heart accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with medical stress. "How are you feeling?" His question carried genuine concern that her analytical mind struggled to process. In Xerathi society, such inquiries served tactical purposes, assessing unit readiness and identifying potential weaknesses. But the warmth in Jackson's voice suggested something else entirely. "My physical condition is optimal." The incident provided valuable data about human tactical methodologies. She kept her response clinical, professional, but something in his expression made her continue. "I do not understand your species' willingness to sacrifice individual capabilities for group survival." Jackson stepped into the room, and she noticed that he'd changed out of his tactical gear. In civilian clothing, he looked younger, less like a soldier, and more like the humans she occasionally observed in the Academy's recreational areas. "It's not really about sacrifice. It's about knowing that someone has your back." His words carried meanings that her linguistic processors couldn't fully decode. She wanted to understand, needed to understand, but the concepts existed outside her frame of reference. "Explain," the word emerged more forcefully than she'd intended. Jackson's expression shifted, and she saw something that might have been recognition, as if he'd finally identified something he'd been searching for. When Lila's equipment failed, she didn't give up. She found another way because she knew we were counting on her. When Reese donated her power cells, she wasn't thinking about her own survival, she was thinking about ours. He moved closer, and the Xerathi became aware of the way the medical bay's lighting caught the gold flecks in his eyes. "We're stronger together than we are alone. Not because we lose individual capability, but because we gain something more valuable." Her analytical mind worked to process the concept, but found only contradictions and logical inconsistencies. Yet watching him speak, seeing the absolute conviction in his expression, she began to understand that human logic operated on principles her species had never considered. "What do you gain?" The question emerged as a whisper, and she realized she genuinely wanted to know the answer. "Purpose. Meaning. Something worth fighting for that's bigger than yourself." His hand moved toward hers, then stopped, as if he'd suddenly remembered the vast differences between their species. Thex'vira looked down at the space between them, measuring the distance in centimeters that might as well have been light years. "Your species' approach to combat operations defies rational analysis." Her words carried less conviction than before. Jackson's mouth quirked into that strange human expression, the smile that served no tactical purpose, yet somehow conveyed warmth and understanding. Yeah, well, we've never been accused of being entirely rational. Silence settled between them, filled with the hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of academy operations. Thex'vira found herself studying his face, cataloging details that served no analytical purpose. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of some past injury. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality she didn't recognize. "I would like to understand your tactical methodologies better." It was as close to a confession as her training would allow. Jackson's expression shifted again, and she saw something that made her secondary heart skip, hope, perhaps, or anticipation. "I could show you, if you want." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible distance. Thex'vira's analytical mind immediately began calculating risk assessments and probability matrices, but for the first time in her life, she pushed the analysis aside. "Yes." The word emerged with quiet conviction, and she saw Jackson's smile widen into something that illuminated his entire face. In that moment, surrounded by the sterile atmosphere of the medical bay, Thex'vira began to understand that her carefully constructed worldview was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. And for the first time in her perfectly logical existence, that uncertainty felt like something approaching anticipation rather than fear. The following weeks passed in a blur of training exercises and tactical simulations that challenged everything Thex'vira thought she understood about military doctrine. She found herself volunteering for mixed species operations, drawn by a curiosity that her analytical mind couldn't fully explain. Watching humans operate in combat situations was like studying a complex equation that solved itself through methods that shouldn't have worked. They adapted to changing conditions with a flexibility that bordered on chaos, yet consistently achieved objectives that more rigorous tactical approaches failed to accomplish. And gradually, she began to understand why. During a particularly challenging urban warfare simulation, she observed Reese abandon her assigned position to provide covering fire for Kai when his rifle jammed. The move violated tactical doctrine and left her own sector temporarily undefended, yet somehow resulted in the team accomplishing their mission with 0 casualties. In a Xerathi unit, such deviation would have been considered grounds for disciplinary action. Among humans, it was simply Tuesday. Jackson became her unofficial guide to understanding human tactical psychology, spending hours explaining the subtle dynamics that governed human team interactions. She learned about concepts that had no equivalent in Xerathi military doctrine: trust, loyalty, sacrifice for others' benefit. More importantly, she began to experience them. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. She found herself checking on team members' welfare not for tactical assessment purposes, but from genuine concern. When Lila suffered a minor injury during a training exercise, Thex'vira felt an emotional response she couldn't categorize, something between alarm and protective instinct. And when Jackson was selected for a dangerous solo reconnaissance mission, she experienced something her species had no word for: fear for another's well-being that superseded her own survival instincts. The realization struck her during a quiet moment in the Academy's observation lounge, where she often went to process the day's experiences. Jackson found her there, staring out at the Academy's perimeter walls as distant stars wheeled overhead. "You're different." His observation was accurate. She could feel the changes in her neural patterns, the way her thought processes had begun incorporating variables that served no tactical purpose. Her carefully ordered worldview was restructuring itself around principles she'd been taught to consider weaknesses. "Your species' influence has been significant." She chose her words carefully, but something in her tone must have conveyed more than she intended. Jackson moved closer, and she felt that now familiar acceleration of her cardiovascular systems. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" His question carried layers of meaning that her enhanced linguistic processors were finally beginning to decode. Uncertainty, hope, and something else, something that made her primary heart skip in recognition. I do not know. The admission cost her more than she'd expected. Uncertainty was not a condition her species tolerated well, yet somehow admitting it to Jackson felt like relief rather than failure. His hand moved to cover hers, and she felt the warmth of human skin against her own pale flesh. The contact should have been alien, disturbing, wrong, but instead it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. That's okay. Not knowing can be the first step toward figuring it out. His words carried a wisdom that her analytical mind struggled to categorize. In Xerathi society, uncertainty was a problem to be solved through logic and calculation. Among humans, it seemed to be simply another condition to be navigated with hope and determination. She turned her hand beneath his, linking their fingers in a gesture that served no tactical purpose, yet felt more significant than any military decoration she'd ever earned. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of other cadets moving through the academy's corridors, human voices mixing with those of other species, creating a symphony of interaction that spoke of cooperation rather than competition. For the first time in her meticulously planned existence, Thex'vira realized she was exactly where she belonged. And that perhaps the most logical thing she could do was to embrace the beautiful illogic of what humans called love.